When you think about the film catalog of Wes Anderson, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Undoubtedly, most every person familiar with his work will say the unique square framing, the distinct color palette, and elaborate tracking shots that have all made Wes Anderson a tentpole in the film industry. After a childhood where he initially wanted to be an architect and later a writer, Anderson got his first taste for directing by putting on small plays and making Super 8 short films that sent him on the path of eventually directing his first feature film, Bottle Rocket, an adaptation of a short he wrote alongside his childhood friend and one of the stars of the movie, Owen Wilson. He has since gone on to write and direct 11 other feature films, as well as a feature that's an adaptation of a Roald Dahl book. He has also written and directed several short films that act as elaborate commercials, and a few that are adaptations of more Dahl stories. With such an extensive filmography, Wes Anderson has established a unique style that is instantly identifiable at a glance, to the point that people unaware of who he is or what films he has directed could probably give an accurate synopsis of what the Wes Anderson look is. But there's another key aspect of how Wes Anderson makes his films that isn't commonly discussed. And there's a moment in his 2023 film, Asteroid City, that is a blink and you'll miss it hint at this critical part of Wes Anderson's filmmaking.
They do know, by the way, but just barely.
Did you see it? It's just a background prop that isn't necessary for the plot, and upon first glance, doesn't warrant a second thought. But it's this billboard that I couldn't stop thinking about for days after I left the theater. A billboard of a billboard, advertising a nondescript casino. Both of the billboards depict their own versions of the desert landscape that is visible just behind the billboard in question. This perfectly encapsulates what I would consider one of the most key aspects of Wes Anderson's films, a visual metaphor for his layered approach to telling stories within stories, or what's more commonly known as a frame narrative. A frame narrative, or a frame story, is a style of storytelling that involves placing the narrative of your story as a story within a larger narrative, like having a painting inside an elaborate frame. The central point of our focus is enhanced by being surrounded by a complementary work of art. There are also frame narratives that have the main story that we follow in the film enhanced by a smaller story embedded within the main narrative. To stick with our painting analogy, think of it as an elaborate painting of a painter working on a piece of art. The main painting will be enhanced by the nested painting in the overall piece. To put the genre into context with films, think about films like The Princess Bride or Forrest Gump. In The Princess Bride, the central story is placed within the context of a grandfather telling his grandson the story while he's homesick from school. In Forrest Gump, the story is about Forrest reflecting on his life and telling stories about culturally significant moments through the lens of his life journey. The actual story of the movie is told through a frame that gives context and greater meaning to the nested story that is being told. You could, in theory, alter these films so that the story starts and ends on the nested narrative. But with those changes, the weight of the story is lost along with the original theme of the movies, leaving you with a hollow and less impactful story. The concept of a frame narrative dates back to the origin of modern storytelling, with famous literary works such as the Canterbury Tales fitting the genre of a frame narrative. While the overall story is about a group of travelers from different walks of life making the journey to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury, the bulk of the story takes place in the tales that each traveler tells the group to pass the time as part of a storytelling contest. As the medium for storytelling has adapted to modern technological advances, the frame story has not been left in the past, but has stayed a commonly used narrative device, with many modern films employing it with great success. Besides our previous examples of Forrest Gump and The Princess Bride, you can find frame narratives in many classic films like Titanic, where the entire film is told in the context of a survivor retelling her story of finding love on the doomed ship, as well as more recent films like Hereditary, having a nested narrative in the English class about what makes a tragic protagonist, while the criteria explored by the class in discussion fits our protagonist's journey during the film. If you take the time to think through the plots and storytelling beats of modern or classic films, you will undoubtedly see frame narrative storytelling everywhere, especially when you look at Wes Anderson's filmography. When looking more closely at Wes Anderson's 12 feature films, there's a case to be made that he has taken the frame narrative approach in 10 of them. If you look at the progression of his releases, as he's become more experienced with writing and filmmaking, Wes Anderson has committed more and more to this style, showing a real connection with the frame narrative that has become inseparable from his filmmaking style. To really show his progression, we can look at different films throughout his filmography that illustrate his discovery and later love of the frame narrative storytelling device. Let's start with his earliest feature, Bottle Rocket. The film follows friends Dignan and Anthony as they attempt to fulfill Dignan's meticulous plans to become high-level thieves following Anthony's release from a mental health facility. The plot remains linear and is a self-contained story without a larger or smaller frame narrative that the story is dependent on or enhanced by. The story simply is what it is. There's a lot to Bottle Rocket that you can look at as Wes Anderson taking his first baby steps with filmmaking and just starting to find his stylistic voice. As we continue down his filmography, we see Wes Anderson step more into himself with Rushmore, as he begins using subtle references to a larger frame with drawstring curtains to identify different seasons, and a smaller frame with the plays written and performed by Max. But it's his next release, The Royal Tenenbaums, when Wes Anderson really embraces his first major use of a frame narrative. The movie opens with a fictitious book of the film being checked out from a library, with the prologue of the book opening the movie's narrative with the backstory of the family. If you actually pause the chapter header for the prologue, the text on the page is quite literally what the narrator is saying during the introduction.
Royal Tenenbaum bought the house on Archer Avenue in the winter of his 35th year.
This continues throughout the film, with 8 numbered chapter headers splitting up the different sections of the movie, with the final header being the epilogue. The narration of certain aspects of characters' lives continues the book-style framing as well. For example, the narration of Ethelene Tenenbaum's inner thoughts when Henry Sherman proposes to her.
Since her separation from her husband, she had had many suitors.
This storybook framing with expositional narration of key aspects of the story is Wes Anderson's first major use of the framing narrative structure. And it clearly made an impact on him, because going forward, he has continued to utilize the frame narrative in nearly every film except for the Darjeeling Limited. The range and intensity varies, from Isle of Dogs' only frame being a nested story on the history of the war with dogs, and the coming of the child warrior that saved them, to what could very well be the magnum opus of Wes Anderson's use of frame narrative storytelling, Asteroid City, a film that is primarily the plot of a stage play, but is told to us through the layers of a TV show that explores the making of the play and the drama between the actors and director of the play behind the scenes, all of which is woven together throughout the plot. There's even a moment in the film that calls attention to the complexity of the story format.
Am I not in this? Excuse me? I'm not in this.
While this is Wes Anderson's most intense use of the frame narrative structure, it is admittedly a film that is most enjoyed by hardcore fans, and less so the casual viewer. Where we think it's worth spending the most time analyzing Wes Anderson's use of the frame narrative, what we also think are arguably the best uses in his feature films, The Grand Budapest Hotel and The French Dispatch. Both films are enhanced by their respective, albeit very different, framing narratives. Looking at Grand Budapest Hotel, the story begins by immediately diving us into a Russian nesting doll of narrative frames, with the outermost frame being a girl reading a book at the memorial of a noted author, where the next layer is the aged author narrating the book the girl is holding at his memorial, presumably when he wrote the book in question. The next frame is a younger version of the author, living out the narrative that the elder version of the author describes about his journey to the dwindling Grand Budapest Hotel, and his chance encounter with the hotel's owner, Mr. Mustafa. The final layer of the frame narratives is the central story to the movie, of how Mr. Mustafa, then just known as Zero, first came to the Grand Budapest, and the impact that the hotel concierge had on his life, after defending Zero's presence in the fictional country of Zubroka during a war not too dissimilar from World War II. All of these narratives, set apart by the changing aspect ratio to represent the time period, combine seamlessly to play on the themes of nostalgia and how the passing of time inevitably leads to the changing of worlds. We see the physical changes in the hotel during the changing of frame layers as a representation of this, giving more weight to Mr. Mustafa's line,
I think his world had vanished long before he ever entered it.
Mr. Mustafa, as an old man, has now himself fallen into this role and is living out his own sense of nostalgia, which is further represented by the framing narrative. This, of course, is echoed by the author of the book, who now, in his own older age, finds himself nostalgically writing on a story he lived out in his youth, telling the story of Mr. Mustafa reminiscing on the story of his own youth. The layers of framing narrative give us, as the viewer, a physical representation of the cyclical nature of nostalgia experienced by Monsieur Gustave, then Mr. Mustafa, and then the author. Wes Anderson might as well be the next layer in this framing narrative, telling the same nostalgic tale to all of us. This type of frame narrative differs greatly from the one used in The French Dispatch, which follows the publication of a magazine of the same name. Rather than taking the nesting doll approach, The French Dispatch relies on the framing narrative that consists of the outermost frame telling the story of how the magazine came to be in print and its ultimate demise along with the passing of the owner, with several nested frames that each tell the story of one of the magazine's writers, living out a story they are writing for the final publication. Some are rather straightforward reportings on singular days, like Herb St. Sazerac recounting a bike ride through Ennui, where he muses on the town's history and inhabitants in a poetic journey, while others have their own smaller frames, like Roebuck Wright discussing a meal he had with the police commissioner as a young reporter, in the backdrop of a harrowing kidnapping and rescue plot, complete with a car chase shootout. All of these smaller narratives start and end without breaking into another story, and are purely told from the perspective of the writer, mirroring the layout of the magazine itself. The overall frame of the film is the physical magazine, a broad frame to contain the smaller stories within, with each frame serving as the interior contents of the magazine, telling their own respective stories. Wes Anderson crafted the film with the framing narrative to act as a representation of the different modalities within the magazine, a narrative funhouse mirror reflecting the story of the magazine back as a film rather than a physically printed reading. No matter how he employs it, it's clear that Wes Anderson loves to write his films with a framing narrative, and has become a staple on how he tells his stories, just as much as his pastel color palette, symmetrical framing, and distinct dialogue.
Well, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go on an overnight drunk, and in 10 days, I'm going to set out to find the shark that ate my friend and destroy it. Anyone that would care to join me is more than welcome.
So why?
Why?
This is a particular storytelling device that, while it's never too far from the mainstream, is niche enough that the idea of centering an entire career around the style leaves one questioning. What makes Wes Anderson commit to this style of storytelling? While not the sole focus of interviews he has done over the years, Wes Anderson is occasionally asked about his use of frame narratives. When talking about The Wonderful World of Henry Sugar, he said, "I like stories that are stories within stories, and plays within stories, and movies within plays within stories," which is pretty on brand with his normal responses, never fully addressing why he uses the frame narrative approach to storytelling, just that he likes it. when answering questions from AP about his nesting doll style in Asteroid City and his later films becoming more complicated. Anderson replied, "Ultimately, every time I make a movie, I'm just trying to figure out what I want to do, then figure out how to make it such that we do what I want." While the question of why will still creep into our heads every time we watch a Wes Anderson film employ another layer of framing narrative, the fact that as he has become more accomplished as a filmmaker, Wes Anderson still sticks to this conviction of what he thinks is good writing or filming practice, and doesn't concede to whatever the current trend happens to be, is rather admirable. This is the dedication that has led to Wes Anderson's style becoming a social media trend, and other films attempting to replicate aspects of his filmmaking. His sincere dedication to making good rather than trendy art. Even if we never get a deep answer as to why Wes Anderson uses the framing narrative so heavily, we should all still just be happy that we're getting to see this kind of progression in artistry from a truly talented filmmaker. So what is your favorite example of framing narrative in Wes Anderson's films? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed our examination of Wes Anderson's use of frame narratives, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. This has been Cursory Analysis. Thank you.